My name is Dr Bryce Evans and this is the Hidden Histories of Liverpool. In this series we look at the underexplored, the history that is all around you in this great city but which you probably never realised was there. So sit back, relax and enjoy the story of the Lusitania riots of 1915. Today, if you want a bit of food with an ethnic twist, you'd probably go to a curry house or a kebabi or a Chinese. You see these places in every British high street, don't you? Every town and city has a curry shop or a kebab shop or a Chinese restaurant. But 100 years ago, the ethnic food store you would see everywhere on every British high street was the German pork shop. It's the German pork shop where you would get your bit of German sausage, and they were very popular. A lot of people used these places to get their bit of ethnic food, their German sausage. But 100 years ago, in May 1915, German pork shops were all but obliterated from the British high street. Why? Because you had the sinking of the Lusitania, the Cunard liner, and up and down Britain, German pork shops were ransacked, destroyed, vandalised, disappearing from the British high street forever. And some of the worst of that violent mob action happened right here in Liverpool. In May 1915, amidst the carnage of the First World War, the Lusitania, the passenger ship, was sunk, and this provoked outrage in Britain. On the 1st of May, the Lusitania left New York, bound for Liverpool, its home port. But the Lusitania, of course, was never to reach Liverpool, because on the 7th of May, and just 11 miles off the coast of Ireland, Lusitania was sunk, torpedoed by a U-boat. The losses were 1,198 passengers and crew. Now, the loss of the Lusitania provoked moral outrage across Britain, and in Liverpool, Lusitania's home port, the pork shops, the German pork shops, those visible signs of the enemy, soon bore the brunt of the rioting that followed.
So the exhibition was staged at the Maritime Museum really to mark the centenary of Lusitania's sinking. Within the context of Liverpool shipping in the First World War, that kind of merchant story of liners and kind of civilian shipping during wartime. And we also wanted to put Lusitania in the context of a kind of 8-year career from the city, because we felt that the close links that had been made during that time explained some of the reaction afterwards within the city. The idea really with the exhibition was to show that, unlike, say, Titanic, which never really had a kind of a long-term career, Lusitania would have been an incredibly familiar sight down at the landing stage. For 8 years, she'd have been instantly recognisable, and the people of the city made a kind of connection with her and her sister ship Mauritania, and they kind of had the nicknames Lucy and Maury, so it gave an indication of this sort of this close link with the people of Liverpool. In addition, we know that the majority of the crew were based in the city, so again, the loss when she was sunk in 1915 would have been felt particularly kind of keenly on a personal level. Really, the impact would have been felt through the families in the kind of local marine communities along the kind of both sides of the Mersey. We've worked quite a bit over the last few years with many of the families of Lusitania victims and survivors, and every year we kind of host a commemorative event at one of the ship's propellers, which is out on our quaysides. So we knew that we wanted to get those family stories into the exhibition in a very kind of central way. And for us, the real story of Lusitania and her sinking is the impact on those families and on the relatives, that kind of family story is still felt today. People often forget that we're talking about people's grandparents and parents. It's still only 1 or 2 generations away, so it's a particularly kind of closely felt piece of history. For those people, it isn't really history at all, it's a kind of family story.
So what actually happened with these riots? Well, you look at newspaper reports and most importantly Home Office files, and we see that damage to German property, to pork shops up and down the country, was quite serious indeed. Bakers' shops as well, German bakeries are targeted, and for a small time the government actually suspends the import of flour, such as the action against German bakers' shops. But the pork shop is where most of the violence takes place, and so we look up and down the country and you have reports from Southend of the military being deployed against the rioters who are smashing up pork shops there. In Gateshead likewise. In Manchester, 13 men and 8 women, the week after the Lusitania goes down, are up in front of the court for willful damage to property. In the East End of London, the riots are very serious indeed, and you get police reports of a lot of German property getting ransacked there. You also have reports of violent action taking place in Liverpool, and of course it's Liverpool where, being Lusitania's home city, the mob action is most serious. And not surprisingly then, it's the pork shops of Liverpool, the German pork shops, where things start to really kick off. The first attacks on these German pork shops happened here on County Road. And you look at County Road today and stretches for a long way with lots of little shops dotted around. Back 100 years ago, a lot of these shops would have been these German pork shops. So these shops were ransacked, people scattered, furniture thrown onto the street, an absolute mess, mayhem. That was the 8th of May. On the 9th of May, a Sunday, on Scotland Road, a massive German pork butcher shop was ransacked also. That evening, the Liverpool authorities, worried about further rioting, decided that all pubs would shut their doors. On Monday the 10th, we get reports of disturbances spreading to the south end of the city. You have reports of a crowd of 2,000 rifling pork shops along Mill Street, Northumberland Street, Hill Street, Lodge Lane and Crown Street. And here at 142 Smithdown Road, there's a long report on a pork shop destroyed. So the Liverpool Echo writes, a large shop at the corner of Smithdown Road and Arundel Avenue had been absolutely wrecked. All the windows had been smashed and the stock commandeered or thrown out onto the street. Women hurled strings of sausages at one another, and one woman in a neighbouring street went down on her knees and scrubbed the pavement with a joint of pork. Other women went home with their aprons full of pork and bacon. After sacking shops, the invaders went into the living room upstairs and spread destruction everywhere. The piano was splintered to matchwood and hurled into the street. A man came to the gaping hole where the front window had been and, waving a mirror over his head, smashed it to fragments against the stone still amid cheers from the crowd below. The significant thing about these disturbances comes in the newspaper report, which goes on, and I quote, "Nothing has been seen like this since the Great Transport Strike of 1911. The rioters did not go about their work in a mad frenzy. There was a thoroughness about it. Nor were they stimulated to action by the tempestuous of liquor-fueled individuals. There was a resentful deliberateness running through all the shop wrecking, and the prime movers in most cases were women. Women, the wives and relatives of Stokehold crews of British liners, who rightly or wrongly were stubbornly determined to take the law into their own hands." Now here we are on Breck Road near Anfield Football Stadium, and this business behind me, which at the time was a pub, number 283 Breck Road, was one of those places targeted by violent mob action, by the mob. Now it was run by a man and a woman, middle-aged couple, both born in Liverpool, but they happened to be second-generation Germans. The mob, or someone in the mob remembering this, the call goes up and the pub is smashed to pieces. One of the ironies and indeed the tragedies about this latest episode of violent mob activity in 1915 is that the son of this couple was actually fighting with the British Army in Flanders at the time in the First World War. So that son actually goes on to die in the last year of the war fighting for the British Army against the Germans. Back at home, his mother and father are physically attacked. Their pub is ruined here. Now, one of the best accounts of the 1915 riots is by a guy called Pat O'Mara, and he writes a book in 1934 called The Autobiography of the Liverpool Irish Slummy. And that's published, and in that book he talks about his role as a young lad in smashing up German-owned businesses and pubs just like this one here. It took about 2 days for the names of the drowned among the crew to be published. They were appalling. That night, Freddie and I, clad in our American tailored suits, started for a dance over Paddy's Market in St Martin's Hall. We never attended it, however. Before entering the hall, we walked around Scotland Road, listening to the cries of the women whose husbands and sons had gone down with the Lucy. And we heard the bitter threats made against Germany and anything with a German name. Now, O'Mara's story is set around the broader Scotland Road area, around this area, which is now, of course, completely redeveloped. But you have to imagine this is where it's set. The next scene takes place in Bostock Street, near here. And O'Mara says, we walked down Bostock Street, where practically every blind was drawn in token of death. All these little houses were occupied by Irish coal trimmers and firemen and sailormen on the Lusitania. And now these men who barely 2 weeks ago had carried their bags jokingly down the streets were gone, never to return. Now, O'Mara's story continues. He takes us here to Scotland Road, and he says about the crowds assembling on Scotland Road, angry crowds. Some of the women, drunk, were laughing as mad people laugh when the borderline has been passed. On the corner of Scotland Road, ominous gangs were gathering. Men and women, very drunk and very angry. Something was afoot. We could sense that, and, like good slummy boys, we crowded around, eager to help in any disturbance. Suddenly, something crashed up the road near Ben Jonson Street, followed in turn by another terrific crash of glass. We ran up the road. A pork butcher's had had its front window knocked in, and a crowd of men and women were wrecking the place. A little higher up, the same thing was happening. Everything suggestive of Germany was being smashed to pieces. Up the road, the crowd surged, some cutting into Sawney Pope Street, others going into Ben Jonson Street, others continuing up the road. Down Scotland Road, in the opposite direction, the window crashing was more terrific, clear down to Byron Street. Everyone had a brick or a stick or something tucked under his coat or apron, and there was much pilfering. The police themselves, imbued with bitterness, were the most passive guardians of the law. I recall one stout little sausage dealer pleading with the crowd that her husband wasn't a German, but the name was too suspicious, and the windows went in and the place was wrecked. Freddie turned to me. What about the Huns up our way? I bet they're having some bloody fun up there now. Let's go up there. So we left the Scotland Road mob and took the tram up to our own South End. Freddie had guessed correctly. As soon as the tram got near Charlie Beach's pork shop, opposite St Vincent's Church, a dense mob caused it to stop. Now, Mr. Beach had been living in Liverpool 30 years, but there was a faint suspicion that years ago he changed his name. His big shop was in a shambles when, running from the halted tramcar, we got to it. But Mr. Beach and his son had already made their escape. Then, someone in the mob mentioned Mr. Agter. Mr. Agter was a retired German sailorman, now a naturalised Britisher, and married to the popular Sarah Doran, who was as Irish as a leprechaun. Ah, leave them alone. Sarah always helped the church, someone said. Let's get after Mr. Yag. Yag, he's the bloody Hun. So instead of actors, we raced onto Yag's pork butchers in George Street. Most of us boys were in the vanguard and anxious to be the first to crash the enemy's windows. Mr. Yag was a big, wholesome fellow. He'd allegedly been born in Germany, but I don't think he remembered much about it. I always liked Mr. Yag, but not quite so keenly as I liked to break his window without fear of molestation. As we converged on the big shop, Mr. Yag, arms akimbo, came out with a broad smile on his face. This vanished instantly as somebody kicked him in the belly and a volley of bricks sent in the huge windows. From the sawdust floor, the astounded man had the pleasure of seeing his choice sausages kicked about the place and the furnishings reduced to a shambles. You'll sink the bleeding Lucy, will you? Yelled our Joan of Arc, waving a shillelagh over his prostrate form. I'll give you sinking the bloody Lucy. Bust that up, kick that out, smash in the whole bloody business. left Mr. Yag and Yag Incorporated in a worse mess than Charlie Beach's. Cook's Pork Butchers in Mill Street came next. Now Mr. Cook knew as much about Germany as I did. Later investigation proved that he wasn't German at all. He came from strictly Yorkshire stock and was a devoted student of Mr. Kipling, dashing off a bit of patriotic verse every now and then. But he had a pork butcher shop, and as pork and Germany were now identical items, we left his shop in a shambles and himself stretched across the counter groaning. I began to get sick from all the free sausage I'd been eating. Our next conquest was Annie Monaghan's little shack. Annie was just as Irish as Sarah Doran, but she didn't contribute as generously to St. Vincent's, and this made a big difference. The reason she didn't contribute as generously to the church is she had 6 small children to feed, and her husband was interned in the Isle of Man. But she was quite as good a Catholic as Sarah. Years ago she'd married a German. He was now detained on the Isle of Man. One of our crowd, with remarkable memory, verified this, and the stampede was on. I shall never forget the hysteria of this last debacle, with the 6 children screaming and Annie, like a good Colleen, fighting back and asking no quarter. After doing a second job here, we left loudly, cheering our Commander-in-Chief, herself now sporting a black eye given to her by the fighting Annie. So Amara goes on, describing the aftermath of the riots. The following day, he says, all was quiet, and the police, now mindful of their jobs, started taking an inventory. All damage was carefully checked, and all victims adequately reimbursed. The cost, as is the way with good British justice, went to the taxpayer. Our Commander-in-Chief, the fiery little Irishwoman, was relieved from her chip-chopping activities and given 6 months in Walton Prison for her valour. Several others got minor sentences. There were some disguised blessings too. Most of the wrecked butcher shops were obsolete contraptions, but when the reconstruction architects came in, newer and gaudier edifices were erected. Little fighting Annie Monaghan had always detested her little shack in Frederick Street. So when the government offered to rebuild it according to the original plan, she threw up her hands in horror and suggested a cash settlement instead. Poor Charlie Beach and I were the worst sufferers. Charlie's son dropped dead after racing with his father from the shop to his house in Egbert. And I got a pernicious bellyache on account of all the raw sausage that I'd been eating. Now, in Liverpool altogether, 200 shops were destroyed and the damage was costed at just under £500,000, an awful lot of money. The loss of the Lusitania and this public rage that it elicited was also used in recruitment campaigns. One speaker told a packed Liverpool cinema that any man who felt the loss of the Lusitania and yet remained without a uniform should consider himself eternally disgraced. When you look at places like this, Our Lady of Reconciliation Church in Eldon Street, and think of this place as being smashed up, all the streets along here, a lot of this violent mob action. It makes you think about the role of the mob in history, the riots. Until about 40 years ago, historians just thought that rioting mobs were just drunken fools. About 40 or so years ago, historians start to change the way they think. And they start to look at things like mob action, riots, things getting smashed up, and saying, well, maybe the mob had a logic to what they were doing. Maybe there was a moral righteousness behind the mob. The thing is, though, a lot of these theories are about the early modern period, about the 1700s, the 1800s. When you come to the 1900s, to 1915, when we have the Lusitania riots, that's an awful lot later. Were these people acting in defense of traditional values and moral customs? Was what they were doing right in the moral sense, albeit violent? It's a lot less easy to argue that when you're talking about a modern industrial war economy than when you're talking about riots in a little village or something. So when we think about streets like this, when we think about the violence that was perpetrated to the German community, was this moral righteousness, albeit violent, or was it just wanton bigotry? The funny thing is, when we look at these riots, when we look at the smashing up of property, It seems terribly immoral. It seems immoral to destroy somebody else's property, to smash up their shop, just on the basis of their ethnicity. And yet a lot of the rioters acted the way they did because of a sense of justice, a sense of morality. That tells us a lot about wartime societies with this polarization of goodies and baddies. Suddenly, everything German had become immoral. Suddenly, everything German had become an infraction of fair play. And when we look at the places that were spared, shops which gave a little bit more money to the church or that didn't overcharge in terms of their pork supplies, that shows that there's a certain sense of moral skewing going on here. And who were the best people to have an idea of that angle of domestic economy, of prices or who gives money to the church, etc.? Of course they were women. And when it comes down to it then, we look at these rioters acting out of a sense of moral injustice. And who are they? Most of the time, they are in fact women. A lot of the time, housewives. The interesting thing when we look at these riots in 1915 is this. O'Mara, the book which I've been quoting to you there, is writing about the experience of being an Irish Catholic in Liverpool. And he talks about childhood fights between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. He says, though, in 1915, the enemy for him as an Irish Catholic changes from England for 1 minute to Germany, and how, unbelievably, the hatred of Germany unifies both Irish Catholic and Irish Protestant. So can we see these violent mob actions, these riots, as a unifying force, bringing together these two opposing tribes? On the one hand, I suppose you can, yeah. And we've seen that there's that moral overtone, that anything German had to be opposed because of this German war crime, that there was a moral outrage forcing these people in some ways to carry out these actions. On the other hand, though, when we look at O'Mara's account and other accounts, it's clear that a lot of these rioters are just there to fill their bellies. O'Mara talks, doesn't he, about eating so much sausage he feels sick. But when we come to the most interesting part of the riots, it's this. It's that not just German shops get targeted, that Chinese shops and even Russian shops get targeted. Russians, of course, allies to Britain at the time, and the Chinese, the Republic of China, at this stage in the First World War, firmly neutral. And so when the mobs come down here to Liverpool's Chinatown, and we read the Foreign Office reports which tell us that the Chinese shops are smashed to pieces, Chinese laundries are smashed to pieces, there's Chinese citizens begging for protection from the authorities, we start to wonder at all, are these mob actions moral in any sense, or are they just racist and nasty? So what happened after the riots? I think if we want to get a good idea of the aftermath of all this violence, we again look to reports in the local press. The local press obviously always has a very good angle of what's going on, and if we look at the Liverpool Echo of the time, it reports that 150 German residents are rounded up by the police and removed to internment camps, as much to secure public order as for their own safety. And there was, according to the newspaper reports at the time, no hostility shown towards these 150 Germans as they're bundled together and they're gathered at Lime Street. There's a large crowd. We get reports of a large crowd at Lime Street to see these Germans off to the internment camps, but apparently no hostility shown towards them at the station. Contrast that with the hostility shown towards them in the pork shops. Now, when we think about these riots today, smashing up German shops and Chinese shops, of course there was a lot of racism and bigotry behind these actions. These riots were perhaps from some kind of moral justification, but they were violent, they were nasty, they were targeted against innocent people. They don't, though, represent the whole story of food in Liverpool in the First World War. Liverpool, of course, as a big trading city of empire, food is crucial to the story of the First World War, with the introduction of rationing in 1918. And before that, in the city, you've got stories around food which are all about cooperation. You know, you might have had these 1915 riots which are violent, but you have cooperation around food. You've got a lot of women workers setting up industrial canteens so that they can eat together in the First World War in this city. You've got colleges of domestic science in the city doing their bit for people, running courses on cookery, how to eat better, how to eat less fat, and special courses for war widows on how to prepare food properly. Interestingly as well, in 1918, last year of the First World War, you've got the local council setting up a massive communal kitchen, a massive municipal cafe where thousands of people at a time could eat nutritiously and cheaply. perhaps lessons for today in some of these measures. So it goes to show that the story of the Lusitania riots in 1915, although they're centered on pork and on the pork sausage, it goes to show that that wasn't the whole story. You didn't have to smash up a German shop to get a nice piece of sausage.